just so we've got it on camera, would you go ahead and just tell me your name and where you're from, maybe a little bit about yourself?
I'm Jay Rencher. I was born and raised in Snowflake, Arizona. When I graduated from high school, that was in 1943. At that point, we were in the middle of the war, with the Germans winning significantly up to that point. And then there was no longer young men being called for missions. And they were talking about drafting 18-year-olds. I was 17, and so I got a job in a survey crew, working as a surveyor, an assistant to a surveyor, until I figured the draft would grab me as soon as I turned 18, and I would then be in the Army. And that's about what happened. I was in the group of the first 18-year-olds drafted in Arizona. And that was just barely after my birthday. And so, because of my surveying experience that I had worked at, they sent me to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, assigned with an engineer MOS number, so that I was assigned to the Army engineers. I didn't mind the Army experience. All my life I had been around guns, was very good with guns. I was a crack shot, and I figured I could hold my own with any German that was over there. And so I didn't mind going in the Army. In fact, at Fort Leonard Wood, when I qualified with the rifle, I had the highest score of anybody on the range that year, and that was in the middle of August, a little more than halfway through the year. And I don't know of anyone beating me by the end of the year. Maybe they did, but it had to have been good shots if they did. And so I got through with that, and then they sent me to a special survey school at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, just 20 miles out of Washington, D.C. I was there for a few months learning to be a surveyor in detail. When I got through with that, they sent me my orders. I was headed for England, to an engineer group in England. That's all I knew. When I arrived in England, after crossing the Atlantic in a single ship going across with the German U-boats and all, I expected to be in a huge convoy, and it was a single ship that went across all by itself. The reason was it went fast enough that the U-boats couldn't line up to sink it if it changed course every few minutes. And therefore, the U-boats, unless they just accidentally intercepted it, could not catch the Aquitania or sink it. And so we ended up in England, and when I went to the engineer outfit I was assigned to, they said, "Welcome to the 531st Amphibious Engineer Battalion. We have made the invasion in North Africa, Sicily, southern Italy, and General Eisenhower has handpicked us to crack the Europe coast. You will be the first man ashore when we invade the continent of Europe." And they said, "The reason you're in this battalion is we expect within the first hour, 75% of this battalion will be casualties. 2 out of 3 will be killed, so we're making the battalion triple strength. Where we have had 1 man doing our job before, now there will be 3 of you, and you will work as a unit. You will do everything together so that when 2 of you are killed, the other one will be there to finish the job and get it done." General Rommel, the German general that was picked out of Africa by Hitler to defend Europe had made the statement, I will win or lose the battle of Europe between the low tide line and the high tide line on the coasts of Europe. If I can keep the enemy from getting beyond the high tide mark, I will win the battle of Europe. He was right. Indeed, if he could keep the enemy from getting into Europe with all of their forces, then of course he's won the war. But he knew he had to defend that coast with every ingenious thing they could think of to keep boats and men and equipment from coming ashore. And that had happened throughout the entire coast of Europe. Anywhere it looked like there's a possibility of landing, they had made ingenious pieces of equipment to cut ships to pieces, to blow up vehicles, to do everything they could to keep anything from coming to shore. And they said the 531st Engineers' job is to get there 1 hour before the invasion starts, to clean all of that junk off the beach so that ships can land, vehicles can then land, men can then land, and the invasion can succeed. And that was my welcome to the 531st Engineer Battalion. And so for the next 4 months in England, we practiced, became demolition experts in a hurry that I had never done in my life, set off an explosion bigger than a .30-06 rifle. And so we spent then the next 5 months practicing all the things we would have to do when we arrived on that European coast, using explosives of all kinds. TNT was the most workable tool to blow things to pieces, but if you wanted to cut a steel cable that ran along a lot of the coastline of Europe to keep ships from ever coming ashore, you had to do that with a plastic explosive called Composition C. And it's like a lot of the plastic explosives they use today to implode the buildings and drop them in a heap of rubble in the middle of the building so that it doesn't blow the town away. If you piled enough TNT around that building to do it, you'd level half the town. And so we were very good at blowing things to pieces, which was the easiest way to remove the obstacles that Rommel had put along his coastline. Well, all right. After we had been there, and then with every one of those mock invasions, we would come storming ashore on a coast of England somewhere and practice doing the things that we had to do to get the men and the vehicles onto that beach and off of that beach safely into the area behind the beach. And we were good at it. If we had to cut a big steel spider that was sticking up there to cut the bottom out of a ship if it happened to hit it, you just wrap some of that Composition C around the middle of it, put a blasting cap in and a fuse, light it, and it would just cut that thing into little pieces and fall in the sand, and the ship could come in without a bit of trouble. And so we are now on about the 3rd day of June, began to be assembled in the south coast of England. We didn't have any idea which beach we were going to hit, but we knew we were going to hit one. And the Germans did too. They would try to bomb all the places that might be staging areas, and they knew they were assembling men in southern England for an invasion. But the Americans had done a beautiful job of keeping the thing sufficiently secret. The Germans And they put out a lot of information that made the Germans think it was other places than where they intended to land. The Germans did not anticipate at all us landing where we did. They expected it in other areas. And fortunately for us, the German military commanders were terribly harsh on their subordinates, and therefore the subordinates did not dare make a move that would be wrong. They'd rather not make one than make one that was wrong. They were scared to death of Rommel and the other generals like him, and therefore, until Rommel made the decision, they would not act, and that saved a lot of our lives, because his defenses, his panzer units that were setting all along that coastline, they did not put them in operation until Rommel gave the okay. Well, it wasn't a strategic, great military plan, but the invasion happened to coincide with Rommel's wife's birthday. It was intended to be a month earlier, because that's when the tide would be the lowest, when we could most effectively eliminate the obstacles. We knew we had to cut a 2-inch stainless steel cable where we were landing in order for any ship to get on shore. And so our first job was prepared to cut a 2-inch steel cable in water up to your neck. That is not easy, but it can be done. We found out and learned how and practiced it. We didn't anticipate 5-foot waves contributing to the problem, which made it a little harder when we got to Normandy. Well, all right. That meant then that on the 6th of June, we were now ready for what we had been trained all of this time to do. And I am interfering with your interview because I'm giving you more than you asked for by a long ways.
No way, keep going.
All right, keep going. If you want it to go that way.
I want to hear
We tell you now about the 6th of June, 1944. Okay. First of all, one big difference between the Utah beach that we were assigned to with the 4th Infantry Division and the Omaha beach was that the amphibious engineers were assigned to the 4th Infantry. A Navy unit, and I don't know who or what they were, was doing the same thing on the Omaha beach. We demanded we go in 1 hour before anyone else landed. We had gone through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and we knew exactly what had to be done and exactly the conditions under which we could do it. And we couldn't do it with 15,000 men from an infantry unit landing in that area at the same time that I'm trying to blow up obstacles that if anyone is within 25 or 50 yards of me, I'm going to kill him in the process. So I had to be there 1 hour before anybody else was in the area so I could do my work. And therefore, we demanded, and Eisenhower knew that we had to do that, and he completely consented, yes, that's the schedule. And so the 15th Amphibious 531st Amphibious Battalion loaded in their little assault boats and landed 1 hour before H hour that was 6:30 in the morning. We got there at 5:30. It was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just barely light enough that we could see our friends and know where they were, but it was just but the Germans could not see us very well. If they'd been looking real hard, we were visible. But the Navy was bombarding them with 16 5-inch, 18 8-inch guns. Every gun the Navy had was shooting at the installations, the fortifications on that beach. And bombers were bombing it at the same time. And so all of the Germans were in bomb shelters that had been built for them behind their installations, and they weren't out with binoculars looking at that beach very hard. Therefore, the first hour of our operation was the least stressful, and we suffered the fewest casualties. We were doing our work, and with all the commotion that was going on, our explosions were minor compared to a 16-inch naval gun blowing up in their face. And therefore, the Germans did not really marshal a force against the 531st Engineers. We were destroying their installations as we wanted to do without great interference to start with. And so we had it by ourselves pretty well. We cut the cable. The little submarine would come and drop off 3 men, then they go down 200 yards, drop off 3 more, then they go down another 400 or 500 yards and drop off 3 more. And it was our job to cut that cable and then start working on the obstacles. And as soon as we could clear a path through the beach from the low to high tide, we would put a plastic marker up and then put down a roadway for vehicles to drive on, jeeps and trucks, not tanks. Our roadway was made of sticks, 4 feet long, about that big around, wire weaving them together. So you would roll them out in a big bundle, and the bundle would go about 50 feet, and then you'd tie another, attach.
We got further Johnson. Let's go to roll, Grant. Okay.
Continue.
Yeah.
For every one of those obstacles we destroyed, we had a name for them. Like spiders, if it was a big steel triangular gadget to cut the bottom out of a ship. Dragon's tooth, if it was a big concrete pillar that a tank would run up on and make it helpless and sit there till the Germans could blow it out of existence. The butcher knife was a big steel sticking out of a concrete pillar that if a ship hit it coming in, would just cut the bottom out of the ship and the ship would stay there. It wouldn't go anywhere else. Devil's Gate were poles with big mines on them that if any ship got within a detonating distance of it by hitting a line or one of the poles or one of the mines, it was blown to bits and it didn't go anywhere. And it was our job to eliminate those, and that first hour, we had them eliminated. We, of course, were eliminating only in the areas where we were assigned, where the ships were supposed to come in. And when we got it safe so ships could come in, we would put up a big fluorescent square marker, one on each end, so the ships could know they had to land between those markers, so they would know where to come. All right, and then we would build a road across the debris and the sand so the vehicles could land on that sand and get on that road and get off the beach without bogging down in the sand. One of the big differences between the Utah beach and the Omaha beach was the amphibious unit with the Omaha demanded that the infantry be there to give them added protection. And when you try to blow up one of those big spiders with composition C that blows steel fragments in every direction for a ways, if there are 10 infantrymen laying under it to get away from the German machine guns that are shooting at them, you can't in any way blow that obstacle off that beach. And therefore, the beaches could not be cleared for the ships to land and for the vehicles to land and for the things to go on that had to go on that beach, unless they could remove those obstacles. And if men are laying under it because someone's shooting at them with a machine gun, you're not going to remove a tenth of them. And that was exactly the problem. The Omaha beach ended up being a shooting gallery, and the Utah beach was a landing that was amazingly effective and very efficient. And so we did our job, and we did it well. And we didn't have any idea that all the rest weren't having the same success. All right.
Tell me about those machine guns.
Here we go. We were putting the roadway through, and we could see a machine gun that was just a little ways from us in a concrete emplacement that was very well protected, shooting down the beach at people that were starting to come in. Our hour was about over, and the storm was so big, the time schedule got a bit shuffled up. We were landing in seas with 5-foot waves. The little landing craft were having terrible trouble being loaded, and the whole thing was in a commotion because the weather was very, very difficult to work in and to land in. And so the whole thing was kind of in a chaos. But now the infantry was starting to land and more ships were coming in. The landing craft were beginning to come in large numbers. And we could see the three of us that were there working and realized we weren't three alone. We're a company of men, 200 in about 400 yards of beach, so that you're not alone out there by a jugful. There's a whole bunch of people, but you know what you can do and when you can do it and how you do it, and therefore you stay out of each other's way and get the job done right, or else you end up hurting people. And so we could see that our friends were being shot at a little ways away, but we were down under some dunes, and the Germans were not seeing us. They were looking over us at people a little ways further away. And so I realized we had to stop that machine gun, and I knew we had some reserve packs of TNT that we'd carried to shore with us when he started up under the dune that we'd been working out of. And so I says, keep rolling this stuff out. I've got to go see if I can't shut that machine gun off. And so I grabbed my pack and my friend's reserve pack that was probably about 50 pounds of TNT. Normally 4 one-pound blocks will blow a concrete dragon tooth to smithereens. I must have had at least 30 or 40 pounds. I'm not sure how many, but the packs were not easy to carry up there. They were at least a significant weight. I managed to slip around behind the machine gun. They were looking in front of them, not behind them. I put the two packs together on the side of the concrete emplacement, stuck the cap in, lit the match, and ran around the dune about 50 feet away. And every time we set off a significant explosion, we would open our mouth and yell as hard as we could. It equalized the pressure across our eardrums so we didn't blow our ears out of existence. And so I was laying on my belly with my face in the sand about 50 yards from that nest when the whole beach shook. I didn't have to go look to see if I had wounded Germans or not. I just went back to my guys. The machine gun quit shooting, and we got our road built through. By now, tanks are coming ashore. We had practiced with numerous amphibious tanks that had a canvas canopy around them that would displace enough water that the tanks could float. So they had a propeller on the thing and were an amphibious tank that could go through the water land on the beach, drop their canvas, and they're shooting at the obstacles. So the first tanks to come ashore were the amphibious. We never practiced an amphibious landing in England with 5-foot waves. The freeboard of the tank, where the canvas was only about 2 feet above the level water when it was calm. And so they put those tanks off of the landing craft about 200 yards offshore, and I think I only saw 1 or 2, maybe 3, that made it to shore. The waves would come up, fill the tank with water, and it would sink before it ever got to shore, and most of the 4 men in the tank would sink with it. A few got out and managed to come in with the waves, or a salt boat would pick them up and take them back out to the ship. But the amphibious tanks that they'd counted on for the first wave of tanks to come in were flawed in that they would always used in calm, quiet water. You're not supposed to have a storm in the middle of an invasion, and therefore they weren't prepared for it. Well, all right, now that the beachhead is pretty well cleared, the thing is now starting in earnest. The Germans are defending it tooth and toenail, and bullets are flying everywhere. The Germans had 4 years of perfecting weaponry, and they had us outgunned 100 ways. They had developed an 88 millimeter rifle that's 3.5 inches, that big. And they used it for anti-aircraft, for tank, for anti-tank guns, for artillery against personnel and light vehicles. Our tanks, by comparison, for example, in Africa, started with 37 millimeter gun, that big. They went to a 57 millimeter, that big. Those were the ones that we first had when we landed in Normandy. A German 88 would shoot right through our tank like you do a tin can with a 30-06. Soon after that, our tanks we had were 76 millimeter, that big. And only at the end of the war did we get one as good as the German 88. We had to fight the whole war practically, outgunned. Oh, all right. And they were fantastic anti-personnel. Those Germans would shoot at us on that beach. If 3 men were together anywhere, they would shoot at you with 88 millimeter rifles from a mile away up on a hill where we couldn't see them and didn't know where they were. And we hadn't practiced ever in England in those 5 months we were there training, or 4, of picking up a minefield. And we had from 500 yards to a quarter mile of solid minefield behind every beach in Europe. We knew we had to pick up those mines and get a road through them to get the vehicles off of that beach, through the minefield, to a road somewhere inland where then they could disperse and go about their business of winning a war. It was the 531st job. Clean the obstacles off the beach, then get the road through the minefield. So far, the 3 of us had made it without anyone being killed or severely wounded. And we thought we were pretty lucky and were therefore through the worst of it. About this time, we start on the minefield. The Germans up on that hill can see 3 guys standing up down there with a minesweeper and with equipment to pull out those mines, disarm them, pile them off to the side, and mark with a fluorescent ribbon where the path has been cleared so the tanks and the vehicles could follow our road. They're anti-personnel mines in there with booby traps, so when you move them, they jump in the air 3 feet and explode, spraying the area with ball bearings that they're filled with. It's about 30 caliber, so it's like a 30 caliber gun shooting in all directions at you. And some of the tanks are booby trapped, so when you lift it, it explodes. And if you happen to lift it with your hands, it blows you about 20 feet in the air, end over end, 4 or 5 times before you hit the ground in pieces, not in one chunk. And therefore, it isn't an easy job to go through that minefield and gather a mine up, and they have them staggered in pattern, so it's absolutely impossible for a vehicle to go through that minefield any way they dodge or any way they drive. They're not going to go 50 yards without hitting at least 1 or more mines. And probably 10 feet will get them into trouble. And so we're starting on the minefield. We get about maybe 50 yards into the thing and are having good luck. Our detector is working very well. We spot the mines. We will find about 4 of them that I can find in one area. I tie a rope onto them. Then I go back about 30 yards, lay down with my steel helmet toward the thing, and they pull the mines out. If they explode, they blow us a little sand over us and dirt. And we go back and go another 5 yards and pull them out. And so far, none of them have been booby-trapped, and so we're clipping along at a pretty good rate. The Germans up on the hill see 3 crazy guys down there in that minefield with a detector trying to dismember their minefield. And one artillery shell, you can tell exactly how close they're coming because you hear the whistle of the shell before it gets to you. And the tone, if it's a low pitch, it's quite a ways away. You don't even have to duck. If it's a real high whistle, it's going to hit you right on the head, and you know it. And therefore, you know exactly where that artillery shell is going to land within 10 yards. And so we're up there working away, and one low pitch goes over us about 40 yards beyond us, and we think he's shooting at somebody else. We go about 5 feet further, and this time it isn't a low pitch, it's a very high pitch. And I'm with the detector up in front, and the other 2 guys are about 10 yards behind me, or maybe 20 yards behind me. They pull them out, and they dismember them, and they pile them to the side. And the shell lands just over me, but right between them. And I hear one screaming in agony, and I didn't feel anything hit me, so I thought I was still in one piece, and I could move my hands and move my legs, and I realized that I was still functional. So I crawled back to my friend, and it had lit right beside him, and his legs were so badly hit with shrapnel from the shell that the only thing holding his foot on was the top paratrooper boot laced at the top. It would cut clear through the paratrooper boot at about his ankle, and his other legs were riddled at the same time. And so I knew I had to help him get back to an aid station that they had set up in a depression in the dunes where it was fairly well protected. There was an aid station with some doctors had come in there to help the wounded. And so I started to drag my friend back to that aid station, and he was as big as I was, or a little heavier, and I wasn't succeeding too well at getting him there, so I ran back and shook my buddy that was still laying there, and I says, "Wake up, this isn't time to be afraid. We got to get a hand back there and get him some help." So I shook him, and when I did, his steel helmet rolled off his head, and I could see the piece of shrapnel had hit him in the temple, and he hadn't even wiggled. And therefore, I went back to my job of getting my friend back. I only went a little ways, and some of the infantry boys that had come ashore saw me having my problems and ran to help me. And we got him back to the aid station. And I didn't know what happened until a few days later. I found out that they had cut his legs off just a ways below the knee. And when, I'm trying to remember if it was below or above the knee, but at least in this area, about where his knee was. And when my friend came out from under the anesthesia and saw what had happened, he lay down and died. He would not live. Dismembered. He was a great baseball fan and baseball player. And when he saw that he had nothing to play baseball on, he gave up the ship. And so my two of the three that were to be killed ended up being the other two. And that is rough because we had spent time training to do everything together. We were like brothers. We knew that our lives depended on each other doing their job exactly the way it had to be done, carefully and precisely. And therefore, I realized instantly that we still had to get that minefield done. And I realized if we stood up once out there, we were going to be killed. Therefore, I glommed on to my two infantry buddies that couldn't get out of there until I got that minefields through. And I said, you've just become amphibious engineers. Come with me. And so we went back to our detector on our belly, crawling like an alligator. We did not, I said, if you get up on your knees, I'll shoot you. Don't you raise up 1 minute, ever. And so we crawled on our belly up there with our nose in the sand, and the shells were going over us at people beyond us. But the Germans did not see 3 alligators out in their minefield rooting out their mines. And we got to the far side of it that was about 500 yards right in the area where we went through. And we'd marked a ribbon, and I signaled the engineer leaders back there that we had the road through, they could come. And so now the infantry and the jeeps and the trucks and the tanks had a road through that they could go through. And at about the same time, we ended up with 3 or 4 other roads. The rest of the company had succeeded. And the word had got out about then that you don't stand up when you're running that detector or you're going to be killed. And so all of us were doing our job like we had never been trained to do it, not for 1 second. No one had ever proposed that you can pick up a minefield with your nose in the sand and your head no more than 3 inches above that sand, waving that detector out in front of you until you hear it hum, and then you go carefully move the sand away from the mine, tie a rope onto it, and crawl back a ways and pull it out and hope that it doesn't blow up in your face. Well, by now, the invasion is going full gun, but in the Utah Beach, within 2 hours after we landed there, or 3, there's not a vehicle or personnel stuck on the beach to be shot at. They land, get off that thing, and get out of there within minutes. And therefore, the casualties on the Omaha beach was approximately 10 times what they were on the Utah beach. And part of it was because Rommel had lost his beach defense, and it didn't keep us from getting our people back into the farms and the trees and villages and the area where now they could farm out. And believe me, the scale of that invasion is impossible to comprehend. They landed 130,000 men, starting about midnight before we got there, dropping paratroopers and glider troopers that were landing in every field in Normandy, close to the Normandy beach, so that they could prevent the Germans from bringing their reinforcements against the beach. But the biggest single thing that stopped it was the German panzer commanders were afraid to move their panzer divisions against us until Rommel gave the order. And Rommel was celebrating a wife's birthday far away from the Normandy beachhead, and the commanders were afraid to make a decision and move without his okay. And therefore the panzer divisions that might have come up and blown us out of the area never did show up. So that we had our tanks ashore, our artillery ashore, everything that we needed to give a significant defense at least, were there to do it. And so it went off amazingly well, even though you can't comprehend the slaughter that went on those beachheads. It's something that you just can't believe that could happen, but it does. It happens.
Have you had a chance to go back? Have you ever been back?
No, I've never been back. On the 50-year anniversary of the thing, there was quite a movement to go back, but the amphibious engineer group that were together totally disbanded. In fact, within 3 weeks after we were there on the beach, what was left of us, they had nothing for us to do. There was no other amphibious invasions ever to be made in Europe again. And so they just sent the ones that were still alive to a replacement depot, and then they were farmed out into anybody that needed men with that qualification. And so from the Normandy beachhead, I went to a 14th Armored Division that had just come ashore in southern France. And I fought the war out then, the rest of the war, not in an amphibious outfit that I'd been trained to do, but now in an armored division that consisted of 3 combat commands of tanks, a battalion of infantry to support the tanks, and a battalion of armored engineers, they called them, to go and pick up the minefields in front of the tanks, or if we were retreating, lay down the minefields behind the tanks to blow the obstacles out of the way if the tanks got stopped by something. And so it was our job to keep the tanks going, the infantry's job to protect the tanks, and the tank's job to blow the Germans out of the way. And so for the next 3 years, we did that with 2 weeks on the line, 1 week back patching up our gear and getting it ready to go again, and eating a meal cooked in the back of a truck instead of out of a can or out of a Cracker Jack box. And we then fought our way across southern France in the armored division.
Question for you, before we move beyond D-Day, on a personal level, did prayer play a part in what we were going? Do you have anything to say about that?
A very humorous incident occurred. There was a Polish boy in our group that used to make fun of anyone that prayed, and especially a Mormon that would pray. I never knew another Mormon in the amphibious engineers. I did find one other Mormon in the 14th Armored Division. And so my church connections in the military was essentially zero unless I was at Fort Belvoir, Virginia in school, going to the LDS chapel in Washington, D.C. on Sundays with a very nice LDS experience. But once we ended up in that 531st Engineer, the connection with the church came to zero. But nonetheless, there was considerable praying going on, and I had a Polish friend that would make great fun of me if I would say a prayer anywhere where he could see me. He would always have some crack or joke or comment to make, trying to belittle me, and it didn't bother me in the slightest. But I noticed when we were in that little assault boat, just before they kicked the three of us out to cut that steel cable, here's my Polish friend back there, praying like fury. And I tapped him on the shoulder and I says, "You're too late. You should have been praying 6 months ago so they would send you to Hawaii in the training group. You said your prayers at least 6 months too late. You're coming ashore with me now and we'll see how you fare." Incidentally, he lived through it. But I don't think it was because he was praying in that assault boat. I think everybody was doing a little praying in that assault boat, but to me, I was never promised that I would not be killed. I was never promised that I would come back. I felt I was as good a soldier as anybody else, so I had confidence that I could do my part and could do what I had to do. But I didn't for 1 second think that I had a promise that I was going to live through the experience. But after the Normandy invasion was over and I was still alive and in one piece, I said, "Brother Rencher, you're going to make it. The Lord is with you. You won't have to worry now. You're going to make it. The rest of the war won't be too bad." I changed my opinion when we hit the Siegfried Line, and a mortar caught up with the back end of me as I was running south one day. And incidentally, there was some humor to that, because while we were practicing in Europe, in England, we would build baseball teams and had a little league in the division and with some of the other Army units close to where we were stationed. And in the engineer baseball team, their third baseman was the slowest runner on the team, and that was me. And
You were just getting to the house.
okay. And as I made it to this house and got inside, I was leaving a trail of blood behind me. And the two fellows that I joined that were already in the house says, "We know now how to get you from second to third base. We put a German up here on the hill with an 81 millimeter mortar, and you will make it faster than anybody has ever made it in the history of the world." And that was a fact. What had happened, the tanks had hit a great big blockade that they called for engineers to come blow it out of the road. There was no way to go around it. It had to be removed. And so we put on 50-pound packs of TNT and started up the road to the blockade. The instructions to us were, the Germans are pushed back beyond the blockade. You won't meet any resistance until you get there. It was about a mile and a quarter, a mile and a half from where we were to where the tank said they were stopped. And so in that mile and a half was a little town of Hatton, Germany, right on the Siegfried Line, the line between Germany and France that the Germans had fortified against any invasion from France. And it was fortified to the nth degree, just like the Maginot Line between the French side of the line was fortified. Well, all right. We got into the little town of Hatton on the way, and suddenly we start seeing Germans up ahead of us. And about then a machine gun opens up on us that's out in an alfalfa field. And so we're scrambling to get down in, we were walking up along the road in single file, 25 yards apart, so one artillery shell wouldn't get more than one man or two at the most. And we dive down into the roadside gutter, but that 50-pound pack of TNT sticks up this much above your back. And when I catch up with my buddy a few minutes later, he says, "Take a look at my pack." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I think you'll see something." And there was 3 machine gun bullets through that pack of TNT that, fortunately, that's why we use TNT, because a rifle bullet won't detonate it. And he had had armor-piercing and tracer bullets go through his pack, and the pack had not detonated. That often happens when we were working. We'd get TNT that would be hit with bullets, and it didn't detonate. Well, all right. The reason we were in Hatton, we started up to that blockade, and then we realized that there were Germans all around us. We'd been given some very bad information that the Germans had moved into the town, they had let the tanks go through, and then they moved in to clobber anyone that was coming along after the tanks and would then have a chance to get at the tanks. And so we realized that we were no longer a demolition team, we were now an infantry squad fighting for our life. We also realized that we were out on a limb, because here is 12 men and 200 Germans. We're a bit outmatched, so we decided we better draw back out of the town and get away from as many of the Germans as we could. And so we organized into groups of some that would do the shooting while half would try to make it to the next house down the road. And the 3 men that were with me, the Germans had seen us go in this house. And so I said, all right, I will position myself in the upstairs window and do my best to fire on anybody that's shooting at you. And you get to that house and then you go up in the upstairs window and try to protect me. We were thinking about infantry personnel with rifles and not artillery or mortars that are projectile 81 millimeters around in diameter and carry about as much punch or explosive power as an 88 artillery shell. And so I send the 2 of them down the road first, and as they came out of the house, a mortar shell lands 25 yards over them and a little bit behind a building so that they weren't bothered at all by the shrapnel. And they run down to the house and the mortar drops halfway down there and they're already almost to the house. And so I know I'm in a pickle because the mortar is all set there ready for me to come out of that house. And I said, all right, Brother Rencher, let's see if you can make it to third base. And so as I came out of the corner of the house, I hear a whine of a shell coming down. It hits just 10 feet behind me. Immediately something whops me very hard. It doesn't knock me clear down, but I stagger around for a bit, but I see my legs are still working and my hands are still in shape. I didn't know where it hit. I knew it was low, somewhere, not in the chest area, but down in my upper leg somewhere. And so I realized, hey, they're still working, let's go. And so I took off for the street, and another mortar lands about, this time 20 yards behind me, with me running full tilt. And each time this mortar would bust, the velocity would go up, at least double. And my 2 buddies were up there in this window watching to see if they could see anybody to shoot at, which they couldn't. Here was old Brother Rencher running down the street with a mortar bouncing along behind him every 50 yards. They finally made it to the house, and they dropped 2 mortar shells on top of the house, trying to scare us out again or demolish the house over our head. And so when I got in the house, they says, "Hey, all we need is a German on a hill with a mortar, and you will make a first-class ball player." Oh. It wasn't terribly bad. I survived that and ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and then they glued it back together and sent me back to my company and said, "Go have at them again." All right, that gets us through. We had now fought our way clear across southern France.
Take me to the Battle of the Bulge.
And now we're to the border of Germany. And again, von Rundstedt, who is now, Rommel was killed, and von Rundstedt is now commander of Germany, and he knows the only chance for Germany again is to marshal all the forces Germany has and make a movement that surrounds, annihilates the First and Third Armies that are on the north end of the line. I'm on the south end, across France, southern France, in the 7th Army. And so the Battle of the Bulge starts in the north end with a pincer group that breaks through, and in 2 days it has killed, captured, or wounded 70,000 American soldiers. That's more than we lost on Normandy. Also, they have made a movement and penetrated a significant distance. On the south flank, the objective was to bring them together, cut off all the supplies to the First and Third Army, and demolish them. The southern flank is right on the edge of the Third Army, between the 7th and the 3rd, in the Third Army control, actually. And so Patton immediately contacts his friend General Hodges of the 7th Army, that was 10,000 times the general that Patton was. Only a PFC's opinion. They called all the armor out of the 7th Army and Patton says, "Give them to me." Oh, all right. We pulled into, we only had to go about 40 miles in 4 hours to get into Patton's territory. We had found in the 7th Army that our 76 millimeter guns, if we hit the front of a German tank, it just bounced off like it was nothing. If we could hit the side, the rear, or the track, we could immobilize a tank. At the same time, the German could hit ours in the front, and it destroyed our tank. So the American ingenuity immediately finds some strap metal, welds a little on a layer of sandbags on front of the tank. Now the German 88 hits the sand, that mushrooms the shell then hits the armor, knocks it dead, but doesn't come inside with you. And therefore our tanks had a fighting chance to equal the German tanks that had been superior all through the war. Ours were more maneuverable, and we took advantage of that. Therefore, we would work it so we could get at them from the side or from the rear or or shoot the track off, but we couldn't stop them by hitting it in the front of the tank. Today, if we hit that with a 120 millimeter rifle on our tanks today, it not only, it blows the turret clear off of their tank and blows it 65 feet away, which it did in the Desert Storms campaign. of the same German tanks that were fantastic in our problem. Well, all right. When Patton sees these tanks come into his command with a rack welded full of sandbags that would protect that tank from being destroyed with the first shot that hit it, he had a conniption fit. I can't use the language that he used every day. You yellow SOBs, get those sandbags off that tank. We explained why they were on there, how many lives it saves, how many tanks it saves. Oh, you chicken, a few more adjectives. And the sandbags went off of the tanks. All right. The German are now going to pull their southern pincer movement and surround the armies and win the war. They stick the 14th Armored Division in front of that and says, today you stop them. Doesn't matter the cost, stop them. Of the same German tanks that were fantastic in our problem. Well, all right. When Patton sees these tanks come into his command with a rack welded full of sandbags that would protect that tank from being destroyed with the first shot that hit it, he had a conniption fit. I can't use the language that he used every day. You yellow SOBs, get those sandbags off that tank. We explained why they were on there, how many lives it saves, how many tanks it saves. Oh, you chicken, a few more adjectives. And the sandbags went off of the tanks. All right. The German are now going to pull their southern pincer movement and surround the armies and win the war. They stick the 14th Armored Division in front of that and says, today you stop them. Doesn't matter the cost, stop them. When we started that morning, we had 58 tanks in one combat command, 57 tanks in the other one. 2 combat tanks on the line, 1 in reserve. That if the Germans got past these, then they still had 1 to contend with. When we got through shooting that night, we had 14 tanks in one combat command and 13 tanks in the other, which meant 4 men for each tank had also probably been killed, and that many that had been done. Along with it, the infantry that was with the German tanks not one inch further than their tanks did. And we realized that at the end of that day, the Germans did not have one single thing that could stop us. We could now go right through them. They had used everything they had to hit us, and our reserve of 58 tanks could walk right through them. And therefore, our division commander said, can we go on the offensive? Patton says, no, you can't. Hold what ground you've got. Your orders are to hold your ground. Stop the Germans. They're stopped. Can we now go on the offensive? We can go right through them. No, you can't. Stay there. We didn't realize the damage, of course, that had happened to the rest of the line. We were looking only at our situation right here. We knew we had the Germans whipped right there. We could have gone 50 miles through them if they'd let us do so. But there was nothing left to support an offensive. We didn't know that. And undoubtedly, Patton knew that an offensive without the support to supply it and keep it going and the trucks rolling behind it would only produce a disaster. And so at that point, though, our end of the Battle of the Bulge never went beyond that point. The Germans did not penetrate another foot. It was over at that point. And so their northern offensive got bogged down about as bad around Bastogne, and at that point, the Germans had lost the war.
When you were in that situation and all the violence and shooting and everything going on around you, how did you feel shooting at other people?
You recognized an 18-year-old boy doesn't have great amounts of feelings, but he does understand very thoroughly to win a war. I have to shoot at them and kill them before they kill me. It's either or be killed. That's the choice. And I'm a good enough shot that they better get me the first time or I will get them. And therefore, it didn't bother me too much because I realized that, hey, I can hold my own with that German over there, and he better be a darn good shot, and he better make that first shot count or I'm going to get him, and I intend to do it. And therefore, it didn't bother me to shoot at him too much. There was one very interesting little thing that did happen. In that town of Hatton, when I was upstairs shooting at any German that moved, I saw a German come out of a house 125 yards at most to walk around the corner of the house. And Brother Rencher says, "You are a dead German." And he shot at that German, and he sees the dust fly off the bricks beside the German, 2 inches from his neck, probably. It's a puff of dust just right next to his neck. And Brother Rencher was so totally amazed that he missed, that he didn't even shoot the second shot that would have killed him. A thought came into his mind. There was an LDS mother somewhere in that prayed that her son would be protected that day. And the Lord just protected him. And I don't know that the mind, but Brother Rencher could not believe he missed that German. It was impossible for him to have missed that German. But he only had to wiggle 1,000th of an inch, 1/10th of a second. The bullet 2 inches away from the neck that would have killed him, to answer the mother's prayer. It probably was answered. I don't have any idea. He was an LDS soldier. I don't have any idea. There was an LDS mother praying for him. I did know he should have been dead. And I knew he should have been dead. And I knew I would kill him. And I didn't. So you never know what happens in a war. That's the kind of situation you're in. And you take it. It doesn't bother you. Go on the next day. It'll happen the day after that. And you just keep going ahead until you've won the war.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Can I jump ahead now to when you freed the camp at Moose